This is the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry, brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast. My name's Andrew Jones.
And I'm Sarah Bolt.
How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm really good, thank you. And you, Andrew?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. It's February and we have a good news story.
We have a fabulous story from Kingshay.
Wow.
No less.
From no less. Other services are available.
Got my plug in early there.
You did, and I wasn't expecting that one. I should have.
Should have caught that one.
Yeah, oh well, no worries. But yes, so this month we are focusing on the Antimicrobial Report, Antimicrobial Focus Report, I believe it is, from which is released was released, I should say, on the 27th of January. And here we are. We had the privilege of sitting down with one of the authors to go through some of the details. And I think it's a great, good news story for the industry that we should shout about and share. So, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Definitely. So, without further ado, let's head on to our episode today on the Antimicrobial Focus Report. This podcast has been brought to you today by Chewing the Cud Limited, who offer independent advice for dairy and beef nutrition, cow signals advice and training, along with ROMS mobility scoring. For more details on these and other services available, please visit our website www.chewingthecud.com or email us direct on nutrition@chewingthecud.com. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry. Farmer, advisor, processor and everyone else, we have topics and episodes that will interest you. We discuss the practical and the technical aspects of different UK dairy industry topics. We aim to make you think about what you're doing and ask yourself, can it be done differently? Listen to us speak with specialists from inside and outside the industry about their area of expertise. Subscribe and listen to episodes for free on your favourite podcast platform or sign up on our website www.chewingthecud.com for podcast notifications so you never miss an episode and links to our socials, including our Instagram, Chewing the Cud Podcast. All one word and remember no G. Or email us direct on podcast@chewingthecud.com. If you like what we do, please share and leave us a review to show your support. And that's it. Enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome back to Chewing the Cud. With us today is Kathryn Rowland from Kingshay Farming. As we've already said, here to talk about the Dairy Antimicrobial Focus Report that, as we record, this hasn't been released, so we're incredibly privileged. So thank you very much. So morning to you, Kathryn.
Good morning.
How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thanks.
Good. Glad to see you. And thank you very much for letting me have a copy of this report before it was released in general. Been very privileged, as I say, so thank you. It's a very good news story, I think, for the industry. But first of all, Kathryn, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Right, okay. So I've been working for Kingshay 22 years.
Long time.
It is a long time, but time's flown by, and I always say that time flies when you're having fun. But since joining Kingshay, I started as a placement student when I was at Silhane University.
Yeah.
And
so are you off a farm originally?
Yep. So my parents were dairy farmers based in West Dorset.
Yep.
Commercial dairy farm, family farm, 120 cows.
Yep.
They sold the cows during COVID due to health issues.
Yep.
Obviously, children not interested in the farm.
Yeah.
So I like my 9-to-5 job. But so from a commercial dairy farm, I met my husband at university as well. So started at Kingshay just when they were really doing more with the dairy costings and
Yes.
taking on a lot more herds.
Yep.
And growing the business, started off entering back dates and setting up new herds.
Yep.
And ever since,
Just grown from there.
yeah, so I've moved into being in the senior management team.
Yep.
And very much dealing with data on a day-to-day basis. I manage the dairy costing service,
Yep.
where we've got nearly 2,000 herds using the service.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's a growing industry, and we're always looking at new things that are coming out there,
opportunities.
new
Yep.
opportunities,
Yep.
and new data that we can really drive change on farm.
Yes.
So by doing a lot of the monitoring, which we've got, we then produce reports such as this antimicrobial report to really drive change. Farmers can see where they are within
The industry. Yep.
and because a lot of benchmarking, particularly with antimicrobial usage, is done on a vet level.
Yep.
So they monitor against other herds within the vet practice.
Yep.
But it might be that, as a vet practice, they're high or low
Yes.
anyway. So
Yep.
it's where
Yep.
they sit within the wider industry. And some people have been surprised that actually there's herds are lower than them and can make further changes
Yeah.
to their system to try and make antimicrobial use lower.
So I was going to say, at this point, I'll bring in Sarah.
I was going to say, so from a data set point of view, this is a really big data set. It's one of the biggest ones in the country, isn't it, Kathryn?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So we've got, within the data set, we've got 879 farms across 121 practices. So
It's a fair few.
that is, yeah. And we do it for some of the major retailers and milk processors,
Yep.
such as First Milk and Barbers.
Because this is one of your Kingshay costings, is it? It's one of the extras you do on top of that, isn't it? Because you've got
Yes.
got the level 1, which is your normal costings, and then I can't remember what the difference off the top of my head is between 2 and 3, but is it on level 3?
Yeah. So we've got the core margin over purchase feed costings,
Yep.
which is on the level 1,
Yep.
which the majority of herds are on that level.
Yep.
But there are additional services, and often they complement each other.
Yeah.
So we collect the livestock numbers and the milk production, which then feeds into and links into the antimicrobial usage.
I bring Sarah in at this point because I seem to remember, as I mentioned this to you before we sat down recording this, hearing you speak. I thought it was a Kingshay. You said it was back in the day when you were AHDB. You did a trial farm meetings, was it, or something to do with antimicrobial?
Yes, so I was working alongside a PhD candidate at the time, and now got her PhD, Lisa Morgans. It was a University of Bristol AHDB funded project where we ran, it was 5 discussion groups across the Southwest, really looking at bringing in antimicrobial reduction and working out how in that discussion group they could actually help each other bring down their antimicrobial usage. So yeah,
So I was saying,
something quite close to my heart.
yeah, I said to you, I remember that coming out of that meeting. I hadn't realised at that point, because obviously some people use Keckstone boluses, that they contain the Rumensin, and it was an antimicrobial. And you say it stuck with me, obviously, but I know this has been going on because this is the 5th report. Is that right, from Kingshay?
It's the 4th report,
Fourth
but
report.
we've been recording the data for 7 years now. So started in 2017 because as part of Vet Partners,
Yep.
Kingshay, we saw one of their strategy reports that said a key part of that was monitoring antimicrobial
Use.
usage.
Yep.
And we thought at the time, perhaps that's something that Kingshay could get involved
Probably.
in
Yep.
with data.
Yep.
And we
Because
also have
really,
the
it's only
data.
just a little add-on to what most people are already doing, wasn't
Yes,
it? As
yeah.
we talk about the costings already.
But we started playing around with the reports, designing a set of reports that actually, from a farmer perspective,
Yep.
would be clear that, different sections. So you've got antimicrobial class, you've got the comparisons to all the other herds.
Yep.
So where you are within the
Yep.
data set.
Yep.
And also route of administration. So we then had the second page of the report, which is a list of antimicrobial usage and the dose rates and DCD vet and DDD vet.
Well, I was going to say, I've obviously read the report before this goes live to the general public. And I'm glad you say there's a glossary in the back there that talks about what all of these acronyms stand for, because I was going, huh?
They are quite a few, and
There's
that's
a few,
that's because it's come from a vet perspective.
Yeah.
But I mean, what we've done is looking at milligrams per kilogram of PCU.
Yep.
So PCU is a population corrected unit.
Yes.
So it means that we can compare the dairy industry to the likes of the pig industry, poultry, all the other different things. I mean, we're compared to salmon and pheasants and other animals.
All other industries, basically.
Yeah. So we can say that as an industry, the dairy industry is doing ranked this much in terms of antimicrobial usage.
And is that all sort of under the rumour sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Rumour targets.
Yeah. So
rumour is going to say, do you want to explain what rumour is?
So it's the Responsible Use of Medicines Alliance in Agriculture.
Gotcha. Right.
So it's a collective group of industry bodies that are trying to improve and reduce antimicrobial usage on farm. And they've set various different targets, and from that then AHDB started the Medicine Hub, particularly with the pig sector. And then now they're doing it for the dairy as well. What we try to do over and above the Medicine Hub is provide the benchmarking and not just record it, but where you are within the data set.
And let's be honest, we'll get into the detail a bit more. But I mean, the past few years, it's shown, I think it's a great good news story for the industry, how much we've reduced our antimicrobial use. And we're far below what the original target was for this point in time as well. So I think that's a wonderful thing before we even get into some detail of this year's report. Now, I should say it's titled Annual Report 2024, even though it's coming out in 2025, but it's looking at all the data from 2024 effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's for a period ending March 2024. And it's in 2025, but that's just because of the timing of when we do the analysis.
Exactly. Because you're one of the authors as I'll say that again. You're one of the authors of the report, aren't you? And hence why we're here today. Co-author. Yeah. So where do you want to start? Talk about the good news that there is for the industry.
Well, the first page of the report is the summary page, and that looks at trends over the last 5 years. And since 2020, there has been a 19% reduction in antimicrobial usage. And what we've seen in the 2020, 2021 and 2022, we were worried that the antimicrobial usage had plateaued because it was all hovering around 15.7 milligrams per kilogram as PCU. So we then saw in 2023... Which
was already below the 2024 target.
Yeah, so the 2024 target was set by the Rumour Targets Task Force. It was based on their baseline in 2020, and they stipulated that they wanted to see a 15% reduction on that baseline. So we've kind of interpreted that as the 2024 target of 17.9 milligrams per kilogram of PCU. So within the data set, you've got individual herds, and the aim is for the majority of herds to be below that target.
I mean, I should point out, I thought it was well worth mentioning in the report. It says the aim is for responsible usage. It's not for zero antimicrobial use in farmed animals, as these medicines are crucial for maintaining health and welfare when facing bacterial. So I think that's really good that it's a practical. It's not gone, we must be at zero, because it's just not achievable, is it?
No, and antimicrobials are a key tool of the vets. Farmers' toolkit to try and drive,
health and welfare.
Yeah. And if it needs antimicrobials on a welfare case, then it is needed. But the aim is to drive unnecessary usage and
reduce the third and fourth generation stuff and all this to keep it more for human health and all of these sorts of things as well, isn't it?
It's all part of that big One Health. Bringing agriculture and human health all together and actually reducing antibiotic usage across the whole area. So we actually do have some antibiotics to be able to use in the future, and I think that's so important.
Yeah, because a lot of the reports, originally when we did this, we focused on the highest priority, critically important antimicrobials. which there's the third and fourth generation cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones, which is a bit of a mouthful.
Don't say that after a few.
But the aim is that those are the ones that are most critical to human health.
Yes.
So if antimicrobial resistance is in those products, then there's no other way that we can use them for human health. So those are the ones that are considered most valuable to human health. And what we have seen is that in some areas, at the back of the report, there's a page on looking at regional trends. And what we have seen is that the Southwest and the Southeast have shown that of those products are not being used.
Yeah.
So it is possible that there are alternative products to be used to treat animals on farm.
Yep.
And some people said we're not using those at all because there are alternatives. It might mean that the alternatives are not quite as effective, or it might need a longer course dose.
Or I was going to say, I seem to remember there was a drug. I can't remember its name now. I remember the generation before that it was a one-shot drug that did 3 or 4 days. You shot it in the back of the ear. I can't remember what its name was now. And that's now gone, isn't it? I think because it's back to you've got to mix it and you've probably got to treat it for several days, which, the convenience is less convenient, you could argue. But the whole point is it's about reducing those third, fourth, which has obviously been done, particularly here in the South, and just making them effectively unavailable. It sounds wrong, but reducing their usage because there should be limited more for human health rather than animal health.
Because one of the charts, this report does have a lot of charts in. If you're very into data, it's a very good report to look at. But one of the charts looks at the percentage of herds that are using the HPCIAs. So this year...
HPCIAs?
Yeah. So highest priority, critically important antimicrobials.
So if anybody's listening to it, there is a glossary at the back and it's worth looking back to.
So this year... only 3.9% of herds actually use those products, whereas back in 2020, it was up at 14.3%. Yeah. If you look further back still at 2018, then it's higher again. So we have seen a natural trend.
Yeah.
That could be more, but for some diseases, it needs those products to be treated.
Because I mean, looking at the summary, I also thought it was interesting, and it mentioned that despite the reduction in antibiotic use, the mastitis rates and bulk cell counts have also seen some reduction. So it's not that we're using less antibiotics, so we're getting more mastitis, we're getting higher cell counts. Those things are improving as well, which is obviously a fantastic thing.
Yes.
But I suppose it's on the summary there as well, and we will look at it in more detail, but it's interesting that the highest quartile of herds on farms, that's top 25%, isn't it, highest quartile, is contributing 50% of the drug usage.
Yes. So when you come to target further reductions, in the past we've always had reductions in swapping products and using less of using teat sealants instead of dry cow tubes.
Yeah.
So naturally we've used the easy wins to try and reduce antimicrobials. The next challenge will be to reduce it further. And it's the highest quartile that we should be targeting.
But interesting, you said before we sat down, it's not always the same people year on year in that highest percentile, is it?
No.
Highest quartile, sorry.
So on one of the pages, we look at the difference compared to last year. So when you plot all the herds on there is a curve, and the highest quartile is, there is a range. So in previous years, we've had a few herds that have had zero antimicrobial usage, which is really good. We didn't see that this year, but
I should ask, are there any organic herds in this report, or are they deliberately separate out?
There are a handful of organic herds, but it's not something that...
Because obviously their aim is not to be using any anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, it depends what milk contract they're on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's this highest quartile, and it's not always the same herds, as you said, that are in that highest quartile. There's 50% of the herds that weren't high before, and whether there's a disease outbreak or something, they've tried to keep on top of it and used antimicrobials to try and really improve things.
And I guess you could say it shows that even if you think you're at the bottom, you've always got to be aware, on guard, for want of, I can't think of the right word I'm looking for, of what could happen, because it obviously shows that it doesn't take much. You get that one wrong breakout of whatever it happens to be, and it can push your usage up before than you weren't expecting. Just because you're at the top doesn't mean you're always going to be at the top, and just because you're at the bottom, you're not always going to be at the bottom. So you just have to be aware all the time. Vigilant, I think that's the word I'm looking for. You need to be vigilant all the time to be maintaining the health and welfare and hygiene of your herd and the environment, because that could suddenly make a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think it really highlights the fact that actually it's not farms that are always the culprits of high usage, that actually everybody seems to have got the message that you do only use it when you need to use it. And I think that that's a really positive message in itself.
Yeah. Well, in the report, we actually look at the highest user from last year and see where they are now this year. And last year they came out at 124.9, which is really
massive.
high.
Yeah.
And they've actually seen a 69% reduction.
Yeah.
And okay, it's still high at 38.6, but they're no longer the highest user.
Yeah.
And yeah, it'd be interesting to see where the previous year as well we looked at, and they were not high. So there was that one spike in antimicrobial usage that year.
But it shows gains in industry, because we were sort of talking. I mean, I remember 20 years ago when I was in Oz, we could still use Rumensin in Thailand, and things have changed. You know, they were just almost blanket used, weren't they? In terms of, not so much here, I don't think, by that point, but you know, you could use those, and it was just blanket on everything. Now we don't do that, because I guess we've learnt the lessons that these aren't a good thing. We need to be reducing them, and I think this report overall is showing that we're doing that, which I think is fantastic.
And I think it's great as a consumer message as well. You often hear of the misinformation that's spread on social media about use of antibiotics in meat or milk and everything else, and actually this is the sort of thing that we need to be sharing with the general public. This is where we are, and actually what you're hearing about blanket treatment of cattle
doesn't happen. Well, I mean, it has changed. I mean, I certainly remember, my father telling stories of his father being introduced to penicillin just after the Second World War, and this is going to be the cure for everything. You'll never have mastitis again. Yeah, well, how many years later are we, and we've still got mastitis? And then, I mean, he said, I remember as a kid, you just chucked it in the tank with everything else. It didn't, as an industry, we have just slowly, and it shows. I was thinking about something else. I can't remember what it was, another podcast we've done recently, and it just shows that as an industry, we can make those changes. They're not going to happen overnight, but we can make those changes that are to the positive for the industry and to the wider world.
Yeah. So one of the analysis that we do within the report is look at the top 10 products that are used on farm. So not surprisingly, pen strep comes out highest. Not every herd is using it. Of the 879 herds, we've got 578 of those herds are using pen strep. The second product is Betamox, which also contains, it's in the penicillin antimicrobial class. But what is interesting is the fifth product on the list, which is Chloramed. And although only 47 herds are using that product, it's coming out in the top 10 because it's the way it's used, it's primarily used for calves, and it's using it as a blanket treatment for calves and respiratory diseases.
You've also got that for your number 10 as well, haven't you?
Yes, so that product wasn't on the list last year. So last year it was at number 13. So more people are using Power 4 products, which is an oral product.
But again, it was only 42 herds,
yes,
and yet it's up in the top 10.
Yes.
But did you say if that's a blanket treatment, there's a lot of antibiotic going into that stock at that point in time? It's because
I was going to say, I know you make a comment in here, the report a couple of times about the fact the oral antibiotics are probably the more concerning usage in terms of they're the ones more likely to get resistance from, isn't it? I think that's what your report says.
Yeah.
And am I right in thinking that under the new red tractor standards that are coming in February, that the blanket treatment of antibiotics is having will be in there, and as to trying to reduce that sort of prophylactic use?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting that both those are obviously calf antibiotics, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I know I was with Laura Tennant actually earlier this week, and she did a podcast for us nearly 2 years ago. It must be now coming up, and she was on back then, like she was on the podcast. It's feed for immunity. It's. I'm not saying it's. That's the answer to everything. Don't get me wrong, because when there's disease, there's disease. But she very much advocates, feed that calf properly, give it as good a start as possible, and they'll have a better chance of fighting disease. So that's surely going to help you with your antibiotic use potentially as well. And I know as we're talking calves, might well talk about. I mean, something else you highlight is colostrum management, and I was going to say I can't remember the figure, and I don't want to sort of give away, but we've still got that podcast with talking about the immunology. Yeah, I can never say it right. I can never say it right. So apologies to Connor if he's listening, because I know he does. But I mean, that showed that get the colostrum management right, and there was a huge reduction in the antibiotic use, and all of these things, just their management that. I could argue they're the basics that we should be doing right. And if we get them right, it has a big knock-on effect to actually affect something like this report, that actually if you get it right, you don't need the antibiotics. And if you don't need the antibiotics, well, that's better. That's a win-win for everybody in terms of cost, time, and the likelihood of this report, that we're reducing them in the industry.
And I'm guessing it's like, as Kathryn was saying earlier, that we've gone through the big wins of changing products and that kind of thing, and now it's more of looking at those management things on farm, that individual cases is going to be slightly different for each one, but all the management bits that we can look at.
Because one of the things that we've done slightly different in this report this year is, like you said, to bring in the health and cow mortality side of things into the report.
Yep.
So we wanted to look at the trends in antimicrobial usage, but also, is that having an impact on herd health? By not treating the animal, is that meaning that
more deaths, higher cell counts, whatever it happens to be?
Exactly. But actually what we have seen is that mastitis cases and lameness cases have been reducing gradually over the time. Cell counts have also been, this year, I think it's been a really good year for cell counts as a national average. But we're also looking at mortality rates as well, and they've not necessarily improved, but they haven't changed that much in the last 5 years. And what we do look at is the reasons why cows are leaving the herd. So on the level 3 costings, we analyse health and fertility, and we ask for individual leaving reasons for the cow. So their lactation age, and the primary reason, a secondary reason if they've got it. So if it's they've left due to fertility, but lameness might be an issue, then you can add a secondary reason. We also ask how they left, so whether they walked off farm for slaughter, whether they were sold as a milking cow, because we are seeing a higher proportion that are being sold as freshly calved heifers. Whether there's, with the introduction of sex semen, that means that people
excess
have
heifers,
excess heifer replacements. But also what we are seeing is that in the proportion of leaving reasons, we are seeing a reduction in the proportion of forced reasons.
Right.
So forced reasons being health, fertility, those kind of involuntary culls that the cow culls themselves. So we are seeing that in the last 2 years, there is more of a proportion of selected reasons. So cows, producers can select cows more for low milk yield, age, more the production and management, whether it's temperament. So if you're trying to keep cow numbers up, you're perhaps keeping cows for longer, but actually by improving the selected reasons, it means that you can select for performance more and be more targeted. So if you always got a high proportion of cows being forced out of the herd, then you can't necessarily improve.
Yes, you're not allowed. You can't select.
If you want to keep your cow numbers up. So what we've done is looked at that over the last 5 years, and at the moment it's 66% of cows are leaving due to forced reasons. And TB has a big impact on that, but that's probably another
Yeah.
another topic.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. But interesting, I did see on that one actually, is the age exit has actually crept down in the last 5 years.
Yes, and that might be due to selling more selected
Young
reasons.
stock,
so
heifers,
selling the cow before she culls herself, effectively.
Yes,
so she's still economically viable to sell. But yeah, we've been recording the cull reasons for the last 20 years. And one of the things we do look at is the proportion of cows leaving within the first 3 lactations. So if the argument that it takes 3 years for a heifer to pay back the cost of rearing, over those 20 years that we've been doing this report, it's always hovered around the 50% mark. So 50% of cows are leaving within the first 3 lactations.
Yes. Yep.
And the biggest reason for that is fertility, but also health has a big part. So from that point of view, it's always hovered around the 50% mark. So we haven't really seen an improvement in cows leaving.
I think that's a really interesting one, isn't it? That age of exit, because that has quite a big impact on carbon footprints and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I know that's a bit of a detour from today's topic, but I think it's
I
all
suppose
health related.
It is. I was going to say. I mean, where my cow signals had the whole aim of that is to go from 3 to 5 lactations because it reduces your well, it wasn't when it was originally, but now it reduces your carbon footprint. That's come into it. All of these things are better for the cow. But it was something I noticed was interesting that 2019 it was at 3.63 lactations, and 2024 it's at 3.46. So it's hovering around the 3.5, but in actual fact it just crept down a little bit in those 5 years.
Yeah.
And you'd have thought we'd be trying to make those improvements.
It's up, yeah. Or is some of that? I was going to say I was going to say it's too late. This doesn't come into it. I say this last year we've seen a lot of people leave, but this report is from before then, isn't it? This report is 23, 24 effectively. Yeah. But no, definitely interesting, as you say, the fact that even though there's been a reduction in antibiotic use, there hasn't been an increase in mastitis or cell count or lameness to the significant that you notice the difference.
No, which was really promising because that was the aim of the report, was to highlight that. And actually there are some really good news stories within this that we are reducing and improving herd health and welfare. And a lot of that is improvements to infrastructure as well. And you mentioned the cow signals thing.
Yeah.
It's not one thing, it's the attention to detail all the way through.
Yes.
And on the carbon footprinting side of things, feed efficiency has a big key to play with that, and age at first calving. If you're keeping extra young stock on the farm, that can increase your.
But unfortunately, as we sort of mentioned, TB can have an effect with that because you might only want, I don't know, let's say 25% replacements, but because of TB, you keep 30 or 35 because the problem is TB can just suddenly strike and there you go. You suddenly lost a load of cattle you weren't expecting to.
Yeah.
But as I say, that's for another day.
I mean, moving on to route of administration, by far the biggest, I mean, we touched on oral products, but by far the highest proportion comes from injectables. And that might be lameness-related injectables. It's hard to say.
Yep.
But what we've seen is that over the years that has been improving, but it's still a highest proportion. And when you look at the highest quartile of those users with the highest antimicrobial usage, then they are significantly higher in injectables.
Yep.
So, but
do you think that's because we're seeing more injectables used maybe for mastitis as well? Because I know there's a comment that there's less intermammaries being used in here.
Yes. Yeah.
Could that maybe be some of the reason?
Potentially. Yeah. It's hard to say from this report because we don't know how those antimicrobials are used on farm.
Well, it should say, if I've got this right, please correct me, just so anyone's listening. It's taken from the data from farm, and it's taken from what they are sold. Is that the right word? From the vets, supplied by the vets, but they're not actually recording what that Betamox is being used for. It's just that herd of cows. This is our cull data that we record anyway, and we know that they're using so much Betamox or whatever it happens to be. Other drugs are available. But so you don't actually know specifically what a drug is being used for on farm, do you? You just know that that farm is having these drugs, and this is their data in terms of herd health, etc., etc.
Yeah. So as part of the antimicrobial monitoring service, we ask the vet to supply details of antimicrobials used on the farm.
Yep.
We also ask for teat sealants as well, because that's a key part of driving antimicrobial use. And what we do is we adjust it for any prescriptions. So if they're getting it from another third-party source, we would ask for prescriptions. We also adjust it if they've bought tubes in bulk and haven't used them. So we would adjust that. And what we would also use is we would adjust for beef and sheep. So if it's a mixed farm and they're using a lot of products for beef, we would split that out for them if they can't do it themselves. So ideally, you are getting just the dairy herd antimicrobial usage.
And saying that includes young stock as well. It's just not,
it
the
does.
milkers, it's young stock.
So because we're using it as a PCU, the population corrected unit, it's the lifetime of the cow.
Right.
So the actual weight that we use is 425 kilograms.
Should be your average.
So that includes the weight of the calf and all the way through the lifetime.
You mentioned teat sealants then. I think that's a good time to mention them. It's interesting their use has come down.
Yeah, so whether that's because of the data set that we've had, we've got quite a few milk processors that are cheese processors, and that can cause black spots in the cheese. And nobody wants black spots in their cheese. But they are, I think with teat sealants, a lot of people used it back in 2018 and used a lot more blanket treatment of teat sealants and then had issues with either killing cows or it can get to that.
Right.
But now there's more knowledge and using milk recording data to selectively choose which cows to use it on, using based on historic cell counts and that, then I think there's more selective, and that's the key word in this, selective dry cow therapy. So,
and it's quite interesting, I think, with that sealant use as well, that you can get some of the external sealants that won't be included in this. So
true.
I was on farm just before Christmas and was seeing that they were using this external one rather than necessarily using a tube.
Those teat sealants can be a funny thing when you first use them. I remember using them in Oz, and it came out and like, what's this? It doesn't look like mastitis. Like you rub it. I remember rubbing it on the deck of the platform, and it's like, oh, it's like sort of toothpaste. And it's like, oh, they're the first ones that had the teat sealant. They're the first ones we just didn't realise what they were.
Yeah. And I think that you don't, back in those days, we didn't understand that you had to treat the cow differently when you were actually using it. And we've learned so much since then.
Yeah, you don't put it up the udder. You've just got to leave it in the bottom and whatever else it happens to be. But yeah, as you say, things have moved on.
Things have changed.
Yeah.
Things have changed. Yeah. So what other points do you think are worth highlighting from this? Let's say it's a good news story for the industry, and I want this to be shared with people.
So going back to the summary page, the key message on there, we do analyse it by region, which can be quite controversial. But what we have seen is that, particularly this year, the biggest change in antimicrobial reduction has been in the north. And we've got herds all over the UK that supply data into here. But last year, it was up at 17.8 milligrams per kilogram PCU for the north. They've then reduced that by 21% to average 14.8. Now, whether that's because they've swapped products and done a lot more, it's very tricky to say that herds in the north might be doing something slightly differently, or there might be more mixed farming enterprises on the farm. So you've got beef and sheep. So perhaps the dairy is not such a large part of the business.
Well, I asked you before we started, wasn't it? Because I'd highlighted to myself, it illustrates high usage in North and Scotland region. Is this potentially because of the weather? You know, but maybe higher instances of respiratory disease because they're up, well, colder and wetter than what we are down here.
And I guess the other thing is to think about is actually the vet. It's not just down to the farmer as to what treatments they're using, that actually it depends on vets and vet practices and that sort of thing as well, doesn't it? So it's hard perhaps to put your finger on it. But.
Yeah, because I was listening to a webinar the other day and we had a range of different vets by age.
Yep. Okay.
And a lot of the younger vets that have just freshly graduated, they're taught not to use antimicrobials as the first instance, and that there's other products, more homeopathy and that side of things to use instead.
Yep.
Whereas the older generation, perhaps that's historically how they've always treated them.
Yeah.
And they've got their set products that they've always used and swear by.
Yeah, they know it works.
Yes.
Job done.
So it might be, and that's why I think it would be really interesting to do more analysis of this, whether it's possible, but...
Yeah, whether vets will let you.
Yes. I can say that because I'm not a vet. So. But it's interesting that, you know, as a practice as well, is there certain things that they have and that they do, certain products. So
do you benchmark the practices as well? Do you let the practices know how well they're doing against other practices? Is that something that's
do.
Done?
I mean, a lot of vet practices, particularly up in the north, they've only got 1 or 2 dairy clients and the rest are mixed. So, whereas down in the south, potentially there are more vet practices that are just focused on dairy. So that can have a big impact on...
So it could be a multitude of reasons.
It could.
And if you're listening in the north of Scotland, we're not trying to have a go at you at all. It's just it's just something that's been highlighted, and we're just having that discussion as to why is that. As you say, is it due to vets? Is it due to weather? Is it, who knows? Next year it might be the other way around.
Yeah, potentially. And it might be that next year they reduce it down even more. And this is the thing. It's the reduction by individual farmers and seeing the trend year on year. That is where the main focus should be.
Definitely. As you say, we are definitely below what our 2024 target initially was. We have been for a couple of years, but it's still coming down, which is fantastic. I mean, do you know how, as you say, it's to put us against other industries, do you know how, it's not mentioned in here, but do you know how we compare to other industries?
So there was the recent VARS report back in November that looked at different types of species. And they didn't necessarily go into the dairy and the beef and the sheep, so the ruminants, because they didn't have a large enough sample in the medicine hub to confidently say that this is what it was. Because, say, for the pig industry, it's something like 96% of pigs are doing that. So there's a lot more that can be done in recording and providing data to the medicine hub
and all of this data does go into the medicine hub where permissions are given, isn't it? So.
So we are fully supportive of that medicine hub.
But where are pigs then? Can you remember where pigs are in terms of?
I can't remember. I'd have to look it up.
That's fair enough.
They were always quite high on the critically important, weren't they? I think but I'm guessing that's probably changed a lot.
I mean, they've seen a similar trend to the dairy in that it's reduced, but it is still high due to the nature of the way that they rear them.
Yeah. But any other highlights from the regional trends, maybe?
Well, not really from the regional trends.
I suppose the only one that I sort of saw was the south. I think you might have mentioned already. The southwest, south, and southeast all had zero usage of both injectable and intermammary, whatever it is, high priority HPCIAs.
Yes.
Is that the best way to say them? Hold on, I'm going to have to look in my glossary now because I can't remember what that even stands for. High priority, critically important antimicrobials.
Yes.
God.
Gold star.
Only if you tested me on it, I would not be passing today, I can tell you.
It's when you try to type it as well. That's why we abbreviate it. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, probably double the report if you had to put all the acronyms out in full.
But one thing from the herd level, and we've plotted antimicrobial usage by herd size and milk yield bands.
Yep.
And what we have seen is that there's no correlation between milk yield. So if you use milk yield as an example of production system, so you've got the lower yielding, perhaps spring calving herds at one end, and then the all year round calving, fully housed herds at the other end that are over 10,000 litres, there's no correlation between antimicrobial use. And that was really interesting, even though there's no story.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a story in itself, in that.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I'm obviously looking at this now, and so people sort of know if you start at 4,000, the average is what, 10, maybe, looking at the graph.
Yep.
And if you get to the high at 13, the average is, where are we now? About 25, let's say, something like that. And that's it. But then there's one just over 8,000. Its peak is nearly at, at 90 milligrams per PCU. And there is just, as you say, you can see clearly on the graph, there's no correlation between yield. And you mentioned it as well, it's the same on herd size as well, isn't it? Which is also really interesting.
And I think that's actually interesting from that consumer point of view, isn't it? That you keep hearing about these large factory farms and how they're pumping antibiotics into them. And actually it shows that's not the case. And I think, again, that sort of data, getting it out there and saying, look, this isn't the case, is a really positive story.
Exactly.
Really positive.
It doesn't matter what your herd size is, what your yield is. If the management's there, you can do it without high usage of antibiotics. And this clearly demonstrates it. Because, I mean, Sarah's just talked about herd size. And again, you've got the smallest ones are around, I am looking at the right one now, 10. And the highest, that's about 1,200 cows, is only just over 20 again. And yet you've got a blip around the highest ones at about 90 and also about 300 cows. It just, the overall trend is slightly upwards in yield and herd size, but we are talking not significantly a great deal. But the outliners are nothing to do with being on the extreme right. They're just suddenly somewhere, we've got an outliner for whatever reason.
Yeah. So if you take 8,000 litres per cow, you've got such a range, but it comes back to how you use your vet on farm, and whether you see them as an investment or a cost. And actually, by using your vet proactively, you can make improvements and save costs further down the line, because vet and med costs are a very small part of a herd's cost of production.
Yeah.
So it's only something like 3% of your total costs come from the vet and med costs. But actually, we are seeing a shift in herds perhaps using their vet more proactively, perhaps using vet consultancy to try and prevent herd health rather than firefighting and treating the animals. Then they're using them to perhaps take a step back, look at the infrastructure, look at the processes, put protocols in place, particularly if you've got other farms or other labour that is perhaps coming in or temporary, or, you've got set protocols that this is what you do, particularly in the parlour and the parlour routine, then it's a set way of doing it. And taking a step back and looking with a fresh pair of eyes, doing more vet consultancy and using it as an investment.
Or using cow signals courses.
Yes.
For your training for your staff.
Definitely. Yep.
But I was going to say, I mean, there's a line here as well. And I mean, we've spoken about herd size and yield. And obviously, I've just realised the one that's at 90 is obviously the same. So whoever this is with just over 8,000 litres and 300 cows it's got the highest use.
Yep.
But as I say, it might not be them next year. But there's a line. There is no correlation seen between antimicrobial usage and calving pattern.
Yep.
Milking frequency, housing period, or breed.
Yeah.
So there's no one breed that's particularly better. There's no one system that's particularly better. There's no difference in 2, 3, 5 times milking or whatever system you happen to know. What's it now? 10 in 7. There's no difference between any of those systems.
Yeah.
Can I just throw one into the pot? It's just come into my head, as it were. Sort of thinking about, actually, you were talking about vets working with their farmers to prevent disease. Do we have any idea as to sort of vaccination usage and antimicrobial usage, as to sort of any correlations, or is that not something that
It's an interesting question. Have vaccinations gone up, and therefore that's meant we need less of them? I mean, obviously we've had the whole BVD programs, and those probably have an effect as well. But is there any of that sort of information out there?
Because there's now a vaccine for mastitis, isn't there? So I mean, vaccines are costly, and some people see that as is it worth the risk, or because it is a big cost and a blanket cost to the whole herd. So within this report, we haven't looked at vaccines, but that is potentially something that we look at in future.
That would definitely be interesting. Is there a correlation of vaccine usage gone up to antimicrobial use gone down?
Yeah.
It's just another tool in the toolbox, isn't it?
Definitely. So on farm, Kathryn, obviously you mentioned that these reports are on level 3. What can you tell us a little bit about more of those reports? What's in there? What can farmers see if they get those reports monthly from yourself?
So what we do is we compare antimicrobial use this year to last year. So we look at the trends on farm, because it's quite important at herd level to look at historic trends. We then look at where they sit within the range. And then we look at what sort of antimicrobials they're using, what antimicrobial class, whether it is more injectables or whether it's the oral products. The reports are designed not from the farmer perspective. So you're always comparing to the group, you're comparing to the targets.
So anyone that's used to a Kingshay report, it's just another page to that report, isn't it?
We've had complaints that there's almost too much information on the one page, because we've tried to cram it all onto one page. But there is a lot of information. There's a lot of charts, because we find that it's more visual. Sometimes it's easier to put the message across. And if a farm sees, actually, I'm not in the highest quartile, that's perhaps a red
to look
flag.
at this. So compared to your standard level 1 cost, what does it cost the farmer, and what's involved to do level 3? I'm guessing you need to be putting their culling data in. I'm guessing they probably need you need access to their vet for what drugs they are getting. But what's the cost for them to do it, and what else do they need to do to be part of it?
Well, a lot of our business comes from the milk processors, of which case is no cost to the farmer. And we also process the data for some of the vet practices within vet partners. So we don't have that many farmers that actually pay for it themselves. But the level 3, it also includes health and fertility, as you said, at a herd level and comparing to other herds. So within this report, we've got about 250 farms, so a smaller data set. But it does show that year on year there are improvements within that.
But you can do the antimicrobial data as a separate standalone comparison. And similarly, other things that we do as well, like cost of production as well. So there's various bits that people can use. We are starting to do more on carbon footprinting. So once we start doing that, there will be it's all the data's
report,
linked.
Another graph.
Because we have got the Dairy Costings Focus Report, which we publish in July. Which is complementary, and some of the figures have come from that report. So that's mainly looking at feed efficiency, of which this year milk from forage has been down because people haven't quite got the forage quality in some areas.
Last year was a little bit dodgy for trying to get forage quality, let's be honest.
Due to weather, mainly. So we are seeing that in the figures, that people are feeding more feed. And in terms of feed efficiency, health and fertility has a big part on that. And improvements in health and fertility can improve
I would also
efficiency.
argue potentially feeding them will improve your health and fertility. I mean, I know I've touched on it when we had Andrew Harrison talking about and amino acid use, particularly in calves, and hopefully Ken March will be following up with that, talking about improved health in calves. There's all these things. I mean, I've heard Hugh McGonaghy talk about glucose usage and how, as soon as an animal's ill, the demand for glucose massively increases because they're fighting infection. So it's multifactorial, isn't it? There's not just one answer to it. There is a nutritional element to it. There's a management element to it. There's all of these things. We've all got to work together to try and improve the results. And the outcome of this report, I think, is the good news story that we should all be jumping and shouting and waving about, because it's shown as an industry we've managed to pull it down. We're already below target of where we intended to be, and I'm guessing 2025's target's probably that little bit further down again. It's a good thing, and even though we're there, we all need to keep working at it to keep bringing it down.
Yeah, and at Kingshay, a lot of what we find issues and feed efficiency can be linked back to Sarah's favourite topic of soil.
Yes. Oh, bring me in there. That was a lead if ever you've got one.
I was just thinking of you actually last night. Actually, we were watching Sandy and her woodland thing, and she was like, "Oh, we've all got to plant trees." But as we did with you, it's not just about trees. I shouted at the telly, no, we need good peat soils as well.
good soils, high organic matter soils. And in fact, as this is going out sort of at the beginning of February, isn't it?
Yes.
We're just heading towards Dairy Tech, where I'm just going to do a bit of a plug here, Andrew. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah, this will come out the day after Dairy Tech, so
Oh, that's all right. So we're really focusing on what Kathryn said there, as to actually healthy soil, healthy forage, healthy livestock leads to that healthy profit.
Yes.
And I think it's looking at the farm in that holism as to the whole farm, and not just one small bit of it, which links really nicely to that what you were just saying, as to it's multifactorial, it's looking at everything. Exactly.
Completely agree. Well, on that, I'm sort of looking at the time. I think you've probably summed it up quite nicely, to be honest with you, but it's time for probably to wrap this up. So I guess any last words of wisdom from yourself, Kathryn?
I mean, the key part is for farmers to know where they are in order to improve. And
if you can't quantify, you don't know.
Exactly, yeah. And that will drive change on farm, and not just from the producer, the farmer, from the vet side of things as well.
So benchmark, basically.
Yes.
I mean, all right, it's not, some might argue it's not ideal because not every farm's the same. Well, it's not, but you've still got to have a starting point, even if it's just your own individual farm, to know, well, our usage today is, I don't know, let's say 50 milligrams per unit. We want to bring it down to 25 or whatever it is, but you don't know unless you benchmark yourself to start, or quantify yourself to start with. And it's monitoring those trends over time as well. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because as it demonstrates here, you might have a peak one year because for whatever reason, but as overall, as long as the trend is downward, then you're on a positive. Yes, definitely. Sarah?
I just think it's a really good news story, and we really need to shout about this across the industry, as to antimicrobial usage in the dairy industry is on its way down. It's below target. Let's shout from the rooftops.
Couldn't agree more. So if you're listening to this podcast, please share it with as many people as you can to show what the dairy industry is doing as as you say, as a good news story. So it should just end. This report comes out Monday, the 27th of January. So we'll be out about 10 days by the time this podcast goes out. Where will people be able to get a copy of this report if they want to read it themselves? So the report's free to download from the Kingshay website. Yep. Kingshay.com. Yep. So there's reports from other years as well, and there's also the Dairy Costings Focus Report on there that's free to download as well. That's fantastic. So if you want to read this in more detail, as you say, there's plenty of graphs and charts on it. Lots of data. Then take a look. But there is some interesting reading in there, definitely, when I was reading through the last couple of days. So I'd like to say thank you, Kathryn, for your time today. That's fantastic. No problem. And thank you, Sarah. As you say, this is a good news report, so good news story. So let's go out and share. But on that, otherwise, I'd like to say it's a goodbye from me.
It's a goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Tune the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. The information must not be relied upon for any purpose, and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses or products during this podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Sarah Bolt are personal and may not be the views of Kingshay Farming Conservation Ltd and any affiliated companies. For more information on the podcast and details of services offered by Chewing the Cud Limited, visit www.chewingthecud.com. Thank you and goodbye.